you're saving money. I think it's your savings account.
You said you just put it in your savings account. You're literally,
Like that fellas, they are working for them.
you're literally working for them. And you won't mind paying them. That's working for them. So what did you say? They're saving money.
If you are happy, the reason why you be happy when your
So
child is working is because you are
right,
happy.
so there's the money that they're going to use.
So
Just
even you shouldn't be like thinking of
I don't care.
maybe one strange relationship. There's
Also, you
anything.
need to tell them how you want to work it out.
So I should give them lessons.
I should give them lessons. Just take like 1 week after
And a week,
a week
Yeah.
minute.
a week before.
Like everybody is supposed to pay me yeah.
Yeah,
Sorry, is this lecture still going to end at 6 o'clock?
it'll still end at 6, yeah.
Okay. All right,
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Yep. That's good, that's good, that's good. Hey,
I want to ask about the tutorial that's scheduled for 2 days.
yeah.
So both the days we have to attend or any?
No, just either one.
Because I wish to choose.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
personal. So it was like, yeah.
Still notifications in like 15 minutes.
Yeah. But yeah, it was helpful for me because I was a bit stuck to which type of art I should look for mine. But he was great help. Yeah, so like I said, he will do a similar session on the last day. Yeah, there's one more. Yeah, so but it was alright.
lecture 3 or 2 hours?
Two.
Oh, 2.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting papers, by the way, about tokenization.
Ah, thanks. Yeah.
Is, maybe you can't say it, but are the essay questions related to digital tokenization?
One could
because I want to write about
Yeah.
it.
One gives the
Okay,
option.
perfect.
Yeah, figuring somebody's going to want that option.
Will
So
they be published?
we'll probably it'll probably either be it'll probably be week 10, so 2 weeks. So not next.
And
so not no. Yeah, so not this week, but next week.
And then you have until the set deadline by Queen Mary, like the 15th or 14th of May.
Yeah, which have they finalized it yet? Or
Yeah.
they have.
But you don't have your own deadline.
Okay.
No,
So
that's a
no,
question,
we can't.
right?
Yeah, no. So
Okay,
we're
perfect.
sticking with theirs. Yeah.
It's one question, right? Not two. Daniela was saying maybe 2 small questions, just one.
I think we had 5 topics. Select one.
But you can pick one.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, thank you so much.
All right. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. First, sorry for the irregular start time. Just to answer a question I've had from a couple of people, we'll finish at our usual time, 6 o'clock, because some of you will probably have classes at 6 o'clock. So we'll finish at 6 o'clock, so just 2 hours. The tutorials, they're both will be the same, so just attend whichever one you prefer. I don't really care which one I'll be here for both of them. What I'll cover in both of them will be identical. So your choice between the two, the Thursday or the Friday. All right, other admin questions before we get started. One last admin issue, and that is next week we will do the first release in talking through the questions. So next week, which is not quite the last class of the semester, but getting close. So next week we'll talk through the questions. Today, so if we look at the second half of the course, we started out after reading week with conduct of business. And that's where we're going to come back to first. Last week, we looked at credit rating agencies, and I'm happy to talk about anything related to those. This week, as I said, we're going to continue, with conduct issues. Next week, we'll be looking at a topic that we've discussed in passing throughout the semester, which is digital assets. So for this week, I actually gave you 2 pieces, one on datafying sustainable finance, which was actually designed to really relate to the special class we had on sustainable finance. And I then gave you a second piece, which was on the ICO bubble, which is essentially about both of our topics. It's about market misconduct and the types of market misconduct we saw in the context of the ICO bubble, but it also gives a foundation for 2 weeks' time as we move into the digital assets discussion. So it sort of flags that digital assets topic. So, questions, comments on anything?
Very interesting.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. And then, I forgot to say, for the crypto assets, I gave you 2 pieces, a piece on decentralized finance, which kind of sets the framework, and a second, which is about the financialization of crypto and building regulatory frameworks. Our timing on that last class is really lucky. What I mean by that is the US SEC just made an announcement last week about its new way to treat digital assets from a securities regulation standpoint. So we'll probably spend a good chunk of the class analyzing that SEC opinion because it gives a good discussion of the digital assets, but they've also sort of broke down their regulatory analysis, which is really useful. And so I'll get that opinion up probably just after class today. All right. So, as I said, I really want to start with picking up a few points from the conduct compliance RegTech discussion last week, 2 weeks ago. But I want to start with a news story which is literally just out. There's our friend Crispin Odey that we saw at the end of the discussion. It seems that he's now admitting rather serious misconduct. But that's not the story I want to pick up. The story I want to pick up is this one. Because as one talks about market manipulation and insider dealing, I've got in the slides, and we'll come back to this in just a second, a related discussion about polymarket and prediction markets, and some real issues about insider trading, insider dealing there. But this story has literally just crossed, and it's extremely interesting from a range of different angles. Traders placed $580 million in oil bets ahead of Donald Trump's social media post on Iran talks from Monday. So Monday, many of us will have seen Trump makes this social media post saying that he's paused attacks for 5 days, that he is in high-level discussions with the Iranian government. We see a massive drop in the price of oil immediately after that tweet. And it's still unclear today whether discussions are taking place or not. So that question about whether discussions are or are not taking place is somewhat still unanswered. But this story is really interesting. So go for the traders made bets worth $500 million in the oil market about 15 minutes before Donald Trump's post touting productive talks with Iran sent the price of crude tumbling and ignited volatility in other assets. Roughly 6,200 Brent and West Texas Intermediate futures contracts changed hands between 6:49 a.m. and 6:50 a.m. New York time on Monday, just a quarter of an hour ahead of the U.S. President's post on Truth Social that there had been in recent days productive conversations with Tehran to end the war in Iran. The notional value of those trades was $580 million, according to FT calculations based on Bloomberg data. Trading volumes for Brent and WTI, so these are two oil indices that the U.S. president has focused very heavily on so far. They're the main ones traded in the U.S. Brent, of course, would have originally been oil from the UK oil fields. There's not much of that left, but that's still a trading price. And West Texas Intermediate, this is crude traded from, and these are traded on Chicago Mercantile Exchange. We saw the example of the trading firm rescuing its traders, families, pets from Dubai to get them back for morning trading in London 2 weeks ago. This is the sort of things that they are trading. Now, of course, 6:50 a.m. In New York time is very early, but of course, at this point in time, this would have still been, now we are 4 hours difference between London and New York. So this is just before 11 a.m. London time, just before noon Central European time. So this is prime trading hours from the European context. It was not known whether one entity or several entities were behind Monday's trades. Trump's announcement at 7:04 a.m. triggered a sharp sell-off across global energy markets and jumps in S&P 500 stock index futures and European equities as investors dialed back bets of a prolonged conflict. Now, 2 weeks ago we talked about this example of the AMF, the French regulator, their ICY trading system. Now, we've looked sort of briefly at sort of market manipulation, at insider dealing. Generally, there are certain times when insider dealing takes place. In other words, the single most common time for insider dealing to take place, actually, I guess, anyone, what do you think might be the single most common time other than before a Trump tweet? Other than before a Trump tweet, what would be perhaps the most common time for insider dealing? Yeah, that's a good one, but no, we're going to exclude Trump and his tweets. So what's the other? How many of you guys are in the M&A class? Yeah. In an M&A, when a company announces that they are taking over another company, what happens to the share prices? Yeah, the target always goes up. Not always, but almost always. And what happens to the acquirer, the buyer? Generally goes down. Generally, people sell the buyer and they buy the target. So, most common time for insider dealing, and this one, please take this one on board personally, is just before an announcement about an M&A. Now, who's likely to know about that M&A? The investment bankers, yeah. Who else?
The board.
Board, definitely, yeah. Others? Shareholders, maybe, depending on, some of the big ones may have to have approved beforehand. Lawyers, accountants,
Competition authorities.
quite possibly, yeah. So you could have a wide range of different parties that would have had information that this is going to happen. And if we look at a program like ICY, one thing that it does, and this goes back to NASDAQ systems in the 1980s, is basically whenever there is a major corporate announcement, an M&A, corporate company A is buying company B, you will typically get a price spike, and the exchange will immediately pull all the trading data for about 6 months before that trade and automatically analyze whether or not there are any unusual trading patterns. In other words, like our Trump example, did somebody buy a whole bunch of shares of the target company the day before the announcement? And if they did, who were they? And if it turns out that the person is a director, an investment banker, a lawyer, a competition regulator, someone who had direct access to the information, that is always your clearest example of insider dealing. That's really straightforward. And that's exactly what we talked about ICY, looking for patterns. That's exactly what we're talking about when we think about that. Now, if you have the information, you are a lawyer on the deal team, and you know that if you trade trade on the information, this is the important career advice, if you trade on the information and you're on the deal team, that almost certainly will get spotted. And that's a very simple insider dealing case, and it'll probably end up with you disbarred in addition to criminal and civil penalties. So don't do that. Now, if you were being creative and you had this information, what might you do with it?
Tell a friend about it and split the profit.
Exactly. So this is our next most common thing, is you tell your partner, spouse, relative, friend, roommate, etc. about the deal, and you split the earnings. And that's usually pretty clear because you're profiting. What becomes unclear, particularly in the US case these days, is if you pass the information to your roommate, just telling your roommate that I'm working on this cool deal, don't tell anybody, and your roommate goes and trades on it. That probably isn't going to be enough for an insider dealing action. It may or may not be, it's borderline. It all depends on what happens with the case. So, look at this. Trump Post. Now, just like our M&A, you know that as soon as he posts this, what is almost certain to happen is the oil price is going to go down.
Is this a way of protecting the trades that his family does? Because I've seen a lot of news of his family trading.
Yeah, we have at this stage no idea who these trades were, but that's the key point, is it does look,
No, but I mean like his posts,
mm,
are they in a strategic way to cover its family?
it's impossible to say at this stage. You know, certainly there are conspiracy theories that will suggest that he makes posts which then family members or friends trade on to make money. This has been one of the allegations about Polymarket. So far, no definite truth on this. This one, however, is interesting. We don't know who the trading is, but the fact is we have a large volume of trading just before an event. So if we're thinking about those exchange systems, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange's system will have immediately spit this out and said, you know, there was a whole bunch of trading just before this event. Now, Chicago Mercantile Exchange, in all likelihood, had no idea about the announcement coming. But what the trading and price spike shows is that that was materially significant to the oil price. So you have a materially significant event, and then you immediately look to see if there is any unusual trading behavior. And in this case, we've got some unusual trading behavior. Could have been random. We don't know. We have no clue at this standpoint. But it's unusual trading behavior. This is exactly what the systems would be designed to flag. Now, this goes to that broader question. The well-timed trades echoed the flurry of large, highly profitable bets made on prediction market Polymarket at the timing of the US's attacks in recent months in Iran and Venezuela. So we'll look at Polymarket in just a second. But essentially, and Polymarket, we talked about this point around regulatory perimeter. It's like digital assets. There's a question. Some things behave like financial markets, but many would argue that it's not. And so questions about whether or not it is actually subject to regulation. But what we have seen in Polymarket is a number of circumstances where you've had essentially unusual bets, and one would generally classify Polymarket as gambling. So for whether that makes any difference whatsoever, are oil futures gambling? Well, certainly for a lot of the participants, they are. But for a lot of people, buying and selling oil is a very real economy activity. So it's a mix. But Polymarket is generally seen as gambling. But you have large bets placed just before an unusual event that had been trading in the prediction markets. So in other words, invasion of Venezuela, attack on Iran, and unusual trading before this takes place. So it's hard to prove causality, but you have to wonder who would have been relatively aggressive at selling futures at that point 15 minutes before Trump's post, said a market strategist at a U.S. broker. White House spokesman Kush Desai said, the only focus of President Trump and Trump administration officials is doing what's best for the American people. He added, the White House does not tolerate any administration official illegally profiteering off of insider knowledge, and any implication that officials are engaged in such activity without evidence is baseless and irresponsible reporting. Several hedge funds noted that this was one of a number of examples in recent months of large trades being made ahead of official U.S. government announcements. One trader at a major hedge fund said energy consultants had recently noticed several large block trades that they found to be unusually timed. Another portfolio manager said a series of large and well-timed trades had created a level of frustration among investors. My gut from watching markets for the last 25 years is this is really abnormal. It's Monday morning, there's no important data today, there aren't any Fed speakers you don't want to front run. It's an unusually large trade for a day with no event risk. Somebody just got a lot richer. In a post, X on Monday, Speaker of Iran's parliament denied any negotiations, triggering a pullback for global stocks and fresh buying about energy markets. However, on the other side, one commodities trader said the sales of oil futures were not huge when measured against volumes in a market that even before the war was highly active, but they had spotted a sharp move in TTF, the European gas benchmark, at roughly the same time. Tim Skiro, head of derivatives, that is a larger than usual volume in Brent and WTI than I would expect, but in the same breath, it's not excessively large. I find it a bit hard to join the dots. So this provides a nice example if one is thinking about automated systems whereby exchanges and regulators monitor market behavior. In other words, this is something that is unusual. It's not necessarily dispositive of anything, but it should, in normal practice, trigger at least some level of investigation to find out who made the trades, to see if there is anything linking them to potentially suspicious behavior. Questions, comments on this one? All right, so yeah, we don't know anything at this stage, but it is interesting. It's an unusual trade, big but not gigantic, at an unusual time. And so it provides particularly these charts. This is exactly the sort of thing that one would expect in a sort of M&A announcement. You'll have the target goes up, the buyer goes down, and you will do 6 months of back testing of data to see if there is anything that looks unusual in trades. And the vast majority of actual insider dealing cases come out of exactly this. very simple sorts of transactions, often a close connection between somebody who is involved in the deal team. Let me pull up. This is the compliance slides from today, and I just want to pull up Polymarket because it's related. Polymarket, Kalshi take on insider trading as scrutiny grows. It's a Bloomberg story, unfortunately, but Polymarket and Kalshi have taken steps to squash some types of insider trading as the prediction market platforms have come under increasing scrutiny for suspected manipulation. Polymarket updated its rules last Monday to clarify that certain kinds of bets are prohibited. Users cannot act on stolen confidential information, wager using illegal tips, or bet if they are in a position to influence the outcome of the events. The changes affect Polymarket's offshore venue, where the bulk of its trading occurs, and its fledgling U.S. regulated exchange. Both platforms debuted market integrity pages last Monday, providing users with information on how the rules work and ways to report suspicious activity. Hours later, Polymarket's main rival Kalshi said in a blog post that it was taking additional steps to prevent insider trading on sports and political events. It will now screen for and block politicians wagering on their own campaigns and athletes making bets related to sports they play. Two interesting selections. You definitely don't want athletes betting on games they're playing in. Why? Because clearly they have a high ability to influence the result, particularly on the downside of those. Politicians betting on their own campaigns, I don't know. Does it really matter that much? Are you going to lose your own campaign to win a bet? Maybe, maybe not. Are you going to be able to influence? Are you going to be more likely to win in any way that you would bet on? But it's just sort of one of those things that it's clearly objectionable to some people that you would have people running for election and betting on the results of their own election. Both companies are focusing on types of trading that would generally be prohibited from other regulated markets. But prediction markets have developed faster than the rules governing them. CFTC, which oversees U.S. prediction market venues, issued the first guidance on insider trading for event contracts earlier this month. The regulator has so far taken a relatively hands-off approach to governing the nascent industry. Polymarket has been dogged by accusations of insider activity, including on contracts related to geopolitics and war. 6 accounts made around $1 million in profits by betting the U.S. would strike Iran by February 28. An Israeli military reservist and a civilian were indicted for allegedly using secret operational information to wager on security operations last year. Issue has attracted attention in Washington, with some lawmakers expressing concern that government officials could trade on information gleaned via their employment. Democrats, including a couple of senators, introduced competing bills that would bar bettors from participating in markets where they have a conflict of interest. So I think this provides, as we think about that idea of regulatory perimeter and also this idea of regulated markets, it highlights something that we used to spend a lot of time on in financial regulation. And that was sort of gambling versus finance. And over time, in more developed jurisdictions, that difference has been eroded to a pretty big extent in most places. But many countries around the world will still have prohibitions on gambling, and there is often a risk that new products and services may edge out of what we might think of as finance and into gambling, and therefore into areas of prohibited activities outside of the scope of financial regulation. All right. I'm going to pick up a couple more quick stories. So, related is manipulation. And so, insider dealing, we see the example in the M&A context. If we look at manipulation, and if we were thinking about manipulation in a usual sort of context, if the US president is essentially making false statements in order to move markets, that would fall into what we would traditionally think of as market manipulation. Now, that would be a stretch from what we know at this standpoint, but it does provide a good example. In other words, if you are making false statements that has an impact on prices of traded securities, which you may benefit from, that's going to take you straight to manipulation. And often manipulation takes place in the areas which is easiest. And so often this will be things or times where there isn't a lot of activity. In other words, it's a lot easier to manipulate the price of a small company than it is of Microsoft. In other words, if I make a tweet about something about Microsoft, it's probably going to be completely irrelevant. But if I make a tweet about a friend's listed company, which is a small firm, that may actually have an impact. And so often, areas where you have less trading are easier to manipulate. And this, from the standpoint of this example, falls into that context. Chinese IPOs in US falter amid scrutiny of manipulation schemes. Regulators crack down after trading in toxic small cap stocks from China inflicted losses on US investors. Chinese company listings on US stock exchanges have ground to a halt after a 2-year boom as regulators in both countries step up scrutiny because of concerns over stock manipulation. Just 2 companies have listed in New York since the start of January, certainly certain political factors here as well, compared with 19 in the same period last year, according to an FT analysis of public records. A record 126 Chinese IPOs occurred in the US across 2024 and 2025. The freeze follows months of tighter scrutiny by China's securities regulator of offshore listings by domestic companies, with no new approvals granted since December. NASDAQ has also tightened listing standards, including by raising minimum fundraising thresholds and broadened its discretion to delay or deny IPOs it believes could be vulnerable to manipulation. Going down past the geopolitics. Regulators in both countries were responding in part to concerns over manipulation in small cap Chinese stocks listed in New York, which has inflicted losses on US retail investors. pump and dump schemes among Chinese stocks are quite serious, said Jamie Selway, director of the SEC's Trading and Markets Division, adding the agency had heard from large retail brokers since last summer that the issue was leading to substantial investor losses. Worries over stock manipulation are one factor behind the CSRC's tighter scrutiny of U.S. listings, as the issuer has become a fresh source of criticism from Washington. The CSRC said manipulation of Chinese stocks in New York falls under the remit of U.S. regulators and should be, quote, dealt with strictly in accordance of the law, adding that it was assisting the SEC in investigations into alleged pump and dump schemes. So we saw 2 weeks ago the IOSCO MMOU, CSRC, SEC, both signatories to that. So that actually provides a framework for cooperation and exchange of information. Interesting to see that despite the geopolitical environment, in certain circumstances, we are still seeing cooperation between those two sets of regulators, in this case in the market manipulation context. We have a number of classic types of market manipulation. One is this pump and dump scheme. What's a pump and dump?
When you artificially inflate the price so much just so that the insiders can get exit liquidity and then profit so that just happens.
Exactly. And this is something that we see across all different kinds of assets. The pump and dump, we look at in the ICO context. I gave you that article. The pump and dump was incredibly common. Basically, someone comes out with something and says, this is the greatest thing ever. Puts out influencers, all sorts of social media activities to drive up the price. The insiders sell out of all of their shares. Then something happens, triggers, price collapses, never recovers. Very, very common. Yes?
What happened to like Dogecoin and Bitcoin in cryptocurrency?
Absolutely an argument on this, yeah. So this is, you see this in any kind of financial product. This sort of pump and dump scheme is incredibly common. Another is what we call front running. Anyone know front running? Well, it's a little bit like what we just saw with Donald Trump. You know that somebody is about to make a trade, and you trade just before them to take advantage of what their trade is going to do from the standpoint of prices. It means that you are taking advantage often of insider dealing knowledge, but it's more from the manipulation side. So these sorts of schemes are invariably common. The typical fraud that we talked about previously, where you just have false information in the context of the product, poor disclosure, these are all very, very common. We've seen really quite an increase in outright frauds and scams in recent years, as you've had the sort of scam farms that have developed in a variety of jurisdictions, often trying to target specific types of individuals to sell fraudulent financial products. One of the headaches, and this is something that has come up in some of the IOSCO discussions recently, is if something is market manipulation, it's going to fall to your securities, your financial regulator. But if it's just fraud, it's typically going to be a police issue. So how does this sort of perimeter work between the financial regulator and your criminal enforcement authorities? And in many jurisdictions, it doesn't work very well. And so this is often a challenge. One more. I'll come back to these a little bit later. I'm going to pull one story from today because it's going to relate to something we're about to talk to. Zaishen, Chinese markets, analysis, did quant funds amplify China's market rout? And essentially, this is, in the Chinese context, we've seen a significant drop as a result of the Iranian war, like we've seen in many other jurisdictions. The question here is, did automated trading activities, the sorts of quant funds that we've been looking at across the semester, did that actually make the situation worse? China's sharpest stock market drop of 2026 has revived a key question for investors. Did the country's fast-growing quant funds amplify the sell-off or merely follow it? So think about this for a second. Amplify or follow? One of our most common trading strategies is momentum. It's a momentum trading strategy.
Take advantage of the time and what's happening.
Exactly. It says what we know statistically is if prices are going up, they tend to keep going up for a while. If prices are going down, they tend to go down for a while. And so the idea of a momentum trade is if prices are going up, you jump in to buy. Now, ideally, you're going to be buying and selling in very rapid order. But the idea is that if prices are going up, you buy. If prices are going down, you sell. And so you're following the trend, but actually if, as we saw in the 1987 market crash in the United States, if the selling actually triggers price increases or price drops, if the selling causes further price drops, which causes further selling, essentially that momentum strategy can make the drop or the rise worse. It amplifies the trend. So, Chinese mainland equities tumbled Monday as a fourth week of escalating Middle East tensions and a broader global market slide weighed on sentiment. The benchmark Shanghai Composite fell 3.6%, about 4.3 trillion yuan, about 625 billion US was wiped from the mainland market. Losses were widespread, with more than 5,100 stocks declining and over 100 hitting their daily down limit. Remember, we talked about circuit breakers. This is that circuit breaker. You have both circuit breakers for individual stocks as well as for broader market indices. Analysts cited external shocks, obviously, as the main triggers, including rising geopolitical risks and a more hawkish U.S. Federal Reserve that has dampened global liquidity expectations and pressured risk assets. Other Asian markets also fell sharply, reinforcing a risk-off tone. Yet, the sharp underperformance of smaller stocks has drawn attention to domestic market structure. Now remember, we are just highlighting, in the market manipulation context, the easiest to manipulate are the ones that are least traded. And that's typically going to be things like your small capitalization stocks where there isn't a lot of trading activity. So, in this case, the question is not necessarily that there was manipulation, but rather that the automated trading had a disproportionate impact on the less traded stocks. So, Wind Micro Market Cap Index, Wind. Anyone from China? What's Wind? Wind's like the Chinese Bloomberg. It's basically a data service provider. It provides information, data about trading activity. So the Wind Micro Market Cap Index, which tracks 400 of the smallest cap mainland listed companies, dropped 6.4%, lagging large cap benchmarks in moves that aligned with strategies favored by quant funds. This has fueled debate over whether quant strategies, often built on similar signals and risk controls. And this takes us into some of those discussions around financial stability. In other words, not just the trading of one firm, but what happens when you have a series of firms that are all adopting similar trading strategies and the risks that can result from those interlinkages. That's macroprudential as opposed to microprudential. Critics say synchronized stop-loss selling can accelerate losses during periods of stress. Stop-loss selling basically says that when something drops to a certain price, you have automated selling. And if you think about the standpoint of an individual investor, one way that is often taught in investment courses to reduce your downside is put in place stop-loss orders. In other words, if you buy HSBC at $100 and you're worried about potential losses, put in a stop-loss order at $90, which says that if it hits 90, it sells automatically. And you could do it on the upside as well. And so stop losses are a very rational approach to addressing hedging risk individually, but if everybody in a market does the same thing, in other words, you have a whole bunch of funds that all put sell orders on HSBC at 90. If HSBC breaks 90 and you have a huge volume in sell orders, the price is going to go down dramatically. And maybe then you have other stop loss orders that hit at 80 or 70, and you can end up with a cascading sale. It's easier to get this sort of impact in lesser traded microcaps. Industry participants, however, say such strategies are largely reactive, pointing to broader pressures including fund redemptions, margin selling, and strains in hybrid fixed income plus funds, which combine bonds with equity exposure that can trigger forced deleveraging. With quant trading accounting for a sizable share of daily turnover in the mainland market, despite relatively small holdings, the latest route is likely to intensify scrutiny of how such strategies behave in volatile markets. Now, I want to do two things before a short break. Slide. So, we've looked at this idea around trading infrastructure. We talked about the Edgar system. We've seen the examples from the standpoint of automated trading. We looked at the AMF ICY example about how the system works. We flagged in the context of particularly European market transformation that one of the biggest drivers has been in the context of stock trading reporting requirements under MiFID, MiFID II, and EMIR. These were implemented in the EU, but also in the context of the UK. And these systems are designed, going back to our efficiency point, to provide information to markets about trading activity in listed securities regardless of where those trades take place. And they drove a series of enforcement actions that has been core to driving the development of in-house compliance and RegTech systems. And what I've given you here, oops, so if we look at these, in between 2016 and 2020, the FCA undertook a series of enforcement actions against pretty much all of the big investment banks. Goldman Sachs, Merrill Lynch, Credit Suisse, UBS, pretty much the full range of your biggest investment banks. The FCA undertook a series of enforcement actions against them for transaction reporting failures. Now, this is interesting for a couple of reasons. The key one is to highlight, one, how the systems work. So let's look at this in a little bit of detail. FCA fines UBS £28 million for transaction reporting failures. This is March of 2019. UBS has been fined $27.6 million by the FCA for failings relating to, this is your key number, 135.8 million transaction reports between November 2007 and May 2017. Now, take that in for a second. Yeah. What's that?
It's not even about per transaction.
No, so this is point one, yeah. That if you're actually thinking about how much the fine was, it's very little in relation to the number of violations. What's actually interesting is you will see a little bit later how it became much more expensive. But the key is this bit, that 135 million transaction reports. Now this is a 10-year period. That's 13.5 million reports a year for 10 years that they did something wrong on. So they actually had presumably more than that in terms of transactions that they actually got right. But this is 13.5 million reports that they made errors on per year over a 10-year period. If you work it out, it comes down to around 3,000 reports every minute of every day, of every hour of every day that the European markets were open for that period. Now, 3,000 trades a minute. We talked about high-frequency trading, we talked about quant trading, we talked about algorithmic trading. This is what it means in reality. Every minute of every day that the markets are open, thousands of trades. Now, we used to think about the compliance function in a big bank that you would have a trading floor. You would all be traders, and at the end of each row of the trading floor, there would be a compliance person. Basically, each transaction is going from the trader straight to the compliance person. That report is then being done and filed. But there's no way you've got a compliance person that is handling 3,000 reports a minute. So the only way to deal with the compliance is automating the compliance as well. You can't do either the trades. You can't hit the button 3,000 times and you certainly can't write 3,000 reports per minute. And so this is an explicit, if you will, expression of how high-frequency trading works, and the fact that every trade in European markets must be reported the compliance requirements. Now, to get to that cost point, let's look in this a little bit more detail. Mark Stewart, FCA Executive Director of Enforcement and Market Oversight, said, quote, "Firms must have proper systems and controls to identify what transactions they have carried out, on what markets, at what price, in what quantity, and with whom." For honest, that seems pretty reasonable. If I'm running a trading floor, I want records of what transactions we've done, on what markets, at what price, in what quantity, and with whom. Not least because I want to be able to evaluate my trading performance to see how my staff have done, and if we have gains or losses, where those have come from, and what we can learn from them. So this doesn't seem unreasonable to require this. But once you look at the scale, it requires a different approach from building a system. If firms cannot report their transactions accurately, fundamental risks arise, including the risk that market abuse may be hidden. In other words, it may well be the case that if we're not reporting this information internally to the firm doesn't know, if it's not being reported to the regulator, that manipulation may be taking place. Effective market oversight relies on the complete, accurate, and timely reporting of transactions. This information helps the FCA to effectively supervise firms and markets. In particular, transaction reports help the FCA identify potential instances of market abuse and combat financial crime. Now here is the granular breakdown. UBS failed to ensure it provided complete and accurate information in relation to approximately 86.7 reportable transactions. So in other words, it had 87 million transactions, 8.7 million transactions a year on average over a 10-year period, that it didn't get all of the information right. It had missed some important information, and in the FCA's checks, they picked that up. It also erroneously reported 49 million transactions to the FCA, which were not in fact reportable. This is my favorite. 50 million transactions they reported that they didn't need to report. That's a lot. If I'm the FCA, do I want your extra 50 million transactions? Yeah, no way. I don't even want your 100 million. What am I going to do with this stuff? But that takes us to SUPTEC in just a minute. Altogether, over a period of 9.5 years, UBS made 135.8 million errors in its transaction reporting, breaching FCA rules. Now, this is the expensive part. The FCA found that UBS failed to take reasonable care to organize and control its affairs responsibly and effectively in respect of its transaction reporting. These failings related to aspects of UBS's change management processes, its maintenance of the reference data used in its reporting, and how it tested whether all of the transactions it reported to the FCA were accurate and complete. So, essentially what this is UBS's computer systems weren't up to the task. We'll come back to the deals. Yeah?
I'm wondering, so it's a fact that they don't comply with the current recommendations with the regulation. which means you violated the regulations, but it doesn't necessarily mean there was an intention or
Yeah.
manipulation.
Yeah, so not,
So
it's not a manipulation, it's
Yeah.
just transaction reporting errors.
yeah, but they didn't comply with the regulations, which again doesn't necessarily mean they are a manipulation. So it's not more relevant question if the regulations are efficient enough.
Ah, well, so this
It's
is,
a breach,
yeah.
but it doesn't mean it is
Yeah.
actually a sorry, it isn't actually market abuse or market manipulation, it's market abuse. So yeah, they don't report, but doesn't mean.
we'll come to this in just a second, because I think it's a fair question. In other words, we had after the 2008 crisis this explosion of reporting requirements. Is it useful or not? And yeah, and we'll come to that in just a second, because it's a fair question.
In one sense, some regulations can trigger a violation of the regulation, but it doesn't mean there is actually a violation. See what I mean?
Exactly.
So
So
it's inefficient.
yeah, and so there is also the question from the standpoint of market efficiency, whether the markets work better or whether detection works. But we'll come to this question in just a second. So the expensive part is they have to fix their IT systems to enable them to comply. Pieces. UBS's change management processes. Change management. This is a consultant phrase. Anyone translate change management? You'll get this in the corporate world very soon. Probably your first day, someone will talk about change management. It basically means that there's a merger, there's an acquisition, there's a restructuring. The consultants have been brought in. They've advised that the firm does something, and then the process of doing the something is the change management. Now, over the past couple of years, UBS has actually had a huge change management exercise going on. What's that change management exercise that UBS has been dealing with?
Giving the right courses and
I think bigger. Anyone from Switzerland? Yeah, exactly. Credit Suisse. Merging Credit Suisse, that's change management. And they actually just announced about 2 weeks ago that they had just completed the merger of their IT systems. One of your biggest headaches in a big financial institution is how you've typically grown is acquisition. Every time you buy something else, it comes with IT systems. And how you integrate those IT systems or not really has a big impact on the ability to monitor and report transactions. Change management, maintenance of the reference data used in its reporting. This is basically how it keeps the information, how it keeps the data about its transactions. Which, if you think about doing 3,000 transactions a minute every day of every year, how you keep and track that data is a non-trivial process. In other words, where are all those things taking place? How do you formulate and save the information in a way it's useful later? And this last bit, how it tested whether all the transactions it reported to the FCA were accurate and complete. So, as we've seen, UBS and other licensed firms have an obligation to make sure that their reports are accurate. And how they will typically do that is they don't necessarily test every report. They will have a sampling process where a certain percentage of reports are sampled and then tested for compliance, which they can then say they have a process in place that enables the appropriate reporting. So basically, what we saw over a period of about 5 years, FCA enforcement actions against all of the big investment banks, exactly this sort of thing, which basically involved each of them in turn, relatively small fines, but hundreds of millions of pounds to build integrated IT systems to enable them to keep track of information. And this is a news story from last week's slides. UK's FCA plans to publish all trading data for London listed shares. So, beginning of last year, the FCA undertook an exercise to review all of these reporting requirements to determine whether or not they were worthwhile. Because they came to the conclusion in an internal review that by the end of 2024, they were receiving, as I mentioned at the very beginning of the semester, 7 billion reports every year, which is a lot. And they then did essentially big data analyses of the data they were taking in to say, is there some of this that we don't need? And came up with an analysis to basically try to streamline. But this is phase 2 to say that in addition to making it available to the regulator is now going to make the information on trades available to market participants on an aggregate basis. So you can't see who made the trades, but you can see the aggregate price information. Britain's financial regulator is aiming to tackle a drastic underreporting of market liquidity that has driven some companies to move their listings to the US by starting to publish all trading data for London-listed firms. Now, there are two aspects of this. One is to say that the information about trading, and in particular pricing, this is very valuable to markets. And the fact that much trading takes place outside of exchanges means that that information about prices off exchange is important for price formation and market formation in the public markets. And after all, everybody has to report this stuff anyway. They spent years finding people and getting them to update their IT systems and then analyzing what they're actually taking in. So it's only one little step beyond for the regulator to publish the data. And it's actually a lot easier for the regulator to aggregate and anonymize the data and publish it rather than to mandate that individual firms publish the data. So they've skipped a step. Now, the question then is, they have a second reason. The second reason is a little bit more dubious. That reason, we've seen since the very beginning criticisms about UK markets for not being very good for listings. One of the arguments that I've made, and Daniele has made throughout this semester, is the UK market doesn't have the same levels of liquidity that you would find in the US, EU, Hong Kong, India, a number of other major markets. And so the FCA is trying to say that actually, no, in reality, there's more liquidity than people think here, because all of these transactions are taking place off exchange. And so trying to say, if we make this data available, our liquidity position looks better. As I said, I'm not fully convinced by this second argument. Yeah.
That's just data, right? It's literally market manipulation of the liquidity data.
Exactly. So I'm not fully convinced by the second one. But the first one is fair. All right, questions, comments on this? All right, let's take a 10-minute break, and then we'll go for the last 30, 40 minutes for the second hour. Okay, now. Yeah.
The corporates, for instance, the investment banks, they have an obligation to provide the
Information to the-
transactions,
yeah.
right? Why will the government or an external company not develop a software which is connected with regulators, so it goes automatically, since the compliance seems becoming more decreasing because AI is doing it, right? Why is not automatically AI pushing the information to the regulators? The information goes through a filter, like a water filter of the regulators. They can publish also the data, like one interconnected system between corporates and
Yeah,
regulators.
it's quite reasonable. Yeah.
And
No one's doing
you
it
have
at the
some
moment.
supervisors,
Yeah.
so then you can check every single transaction,
Yeah.
and it's all automated.
Yeah, no, there's a logic to this. And in many ways, it is kind of, as you say, it's the next logical step.
I should develop that software.
It's not a bad one. Exactly.
I think it's really efficient because anyway they have to provide the transaction. You don't face fines. It's automatic.
Yeah.
And even the regulator can guarantee if you use this software funded by the government, we will not fine you as long as you put the good inputs in
Yeah.
it. So I think it's more market. I mean, it's the idealistic world.
Yeah, well,
But-
you're seeing a number of projects around this that basically this idea of automated regulation.
Data systems.
Yeah.
And it's more
And-
stabilizing the economy,
Yeah.
maybe, in my
And I think there's a reasonable argument in the context of things like this trading data because it's objective. You know, you're not. It's a factual thing.
data.
Yeah. Whereas there are other aspects of
But
regulation that are subjective, like market manipulation. Subjective. It's not. You know, it could be market manipulation, but maybe it's not.
But you
But
mean-
this, for reporting trading data, it's purely fact-based.
Yeah, but you
and so it
mean
could be automated.
The figures are objective, right?
Yes,
That's what you're saying.
exactly. So it
But
could be
how you
automated.
interpret the figures are subjective.
Yeah, yeah,
So it's still
exactly. What you use it for, and this is something, but from the standpoint of just the transaction reporting, it could be automated because the regulator checking the accuracy of
Yeah,
the
that's what I'm
reports
saying.
is fact objective too.
and it will be the most efficient way if you make sure the software of the corporates can connect. It don't have to be the same software, but can be connected with
Exactly.
the regulators. And between the connection isn't like a water filter,
Exactly.
which flags or
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah, who's gonna do that?
I've got a friend who's been trying to do that, but it's harder to sell.
You have to convince government.
Exactly.
And I think governments are really behind
And they're really
developments
risk averse.
and stubborn.
Yeah. So, yes. No. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Keep the break short since we're short this class in any event. So, I want to pick up a couple of things from the financial conduct slides. So, if we look at slide 20, principles for secondary and other markets. We started out with this idea of the principles. If we look at this, there should be ongoing regulatory supervision of exchanges and trading systems, which should aim to ensure the integrity of trading is maintained through fair and equitable rules that strike an appropriate balance between the demands of different market participants. Regulation should promote transparency of trading, and this is the story that we just saw in the UK FCA, this idea of releasing the information about prices of all trading in listed securities to markets. Regulation should be designed to detect and deter manipulation and other unfair trading practices, and this is what we've been looking at from the standpoint of the various sorts of exchange automated systems that are designed to identify potential issues of market manipulation, misconduct, etc. And regulation should aim to ensure the proper management of large exposures, default risk, and market disruption. And these are some of the systems that we've been looking at that try to address high levels of volatility in the context of markets, like circuit breakers, and we'll see another example shortly. Moving to the implementation. If we look at slide 55, part 8 of the FSMA basically implements the pre-existing EU market abuse regulation approach with no real changes. And so we've looked at that previously. One thing that I will flag, and this is the previous slide, is in addition to the hard rules, the FCA, like many other regulators, actually has what we would call a series of principles that are designed to provide guidance, but they're also actionable from the standpoint of fit and proper behavior, as well as various checklists. So the FCA handbook, principle 2.1, actually provides the principles for conduct regulation by firms. And if you look at this, 12 principles, and the expectation is that the firms will build systems to implement these principles, and that those will then be backed up by the FCA's monitoring and enforcement powers, including the senior manager regulation system. Integrity: a firm must conduct its business with integrity. 2, skill, care, and diligence: a firm must conduct its business with due skill, care, and diligence. Management and control: a firm must take reasonable care to organize and control its affairs responsibly and effectively with adequate risk management systems. Financial prudence: a firm must maintain adequate financial resources. Conduct: observe proper standards of market conduct. Customers' interests: due regard to the interests of customers and treat them fairly. Communications: pay due regard to information needs of clients and communicate information in a way which is clear, fair, and not misleading. Conflicts of interest: manage conflicts of interest fairly. Relationships of trust: clients' assets. And we flagged this at the very beginning as a core aspect of securities regulation compared to particularly banking and insurance regulation. That securities regulation emphasizes the segregation of customers' assets from those of the firm. The idea being that in a securities firm, if the firm fails, customer assets should be in separately segregated accounts so that those customer assets are not part of the firm's insolvency. And this is, of course, very different to what one might see in the context of a bank or other type of financial institution insolvency. Relations with regulators: the firm must deal with its regulators in an open and cooperative way and must disclose to the FCA appropriately anything relating to the firm which the regulator would reasonably expect notice. And we saw previously that those internal actions are disclosable to the regulator. For instance, we saw the Crispin Odey case, where they had undertaken within the firm specific investigations, and then he, as major shareholder, sought to block the disclosure of those actions to regulators. Consumer duty: a firm must always act to deliver good outcomes for retail customers. And in addition to the firm rules, you also have rules for individuals in a financial services firm. So the individual conduct rules: you must act with integrity, you must act with due skill, care, and diligence, you must be open and cooperative with the FCA, the PRA, and other regulators, you must pay due regard to the interests of customers and treat them fairly, you must act to deliver good outcomes for retail customers. Senior management functions: so if you are senior manager, you get additional rules which require greater, so we'll have a duty of responsibility. This means that if a firm breaches, the senior manager is responsible for that area, could be held accountable if they didn't take reasonable steps to prevent or stop the breach. SMFs must be fit and proper to do their jobs, and firms need to assess their ongoing fitness and propriety at least annually. So you get the firm conduct principles, you get senior management conduct principles, and then you get the individual conduct principles, both of which are subject to firm rules and systems, but also to review and compliance by the FCA. So that then kind of, if you will, from the standpoint of thinking about how the system works. If we look at moving from the EU-UK context, key anti-fraud provision in the US is Rule 10b-5, which is an SEC rule under Section 10b of the Securities Exchange Act of 1933. Two primary acts: the Securities Act of 1933, and we're going to see more of this one next time when we're looking at definition of securities for digital asset purposes, and the Securities Exchange Act, which is largely about secondary trading. So Section 10b prohibits the use of any manipulative or deceptive device, including materially misleading statements or omissions, in connection with the purchase or sale of any security. And this is the actual 10b section. Shall be unlawful for any person, directly or indirectly, by use of any means or instrumentality of interstate commerce or of the mails or of any facility of any national securities exchange, to Rule 10b, to employ in connection with the purchase or sale of any security registered on a national securities exchange or any security not so registered, any manipulative or deceptive device or contrivance in contravention of such rules and regulations as the Commission may prescribe as necessary or appropriate in the public interest or for the protection of investors. 10b-5 basically takes that just slightly further. Employment of manipulative or deceptive practices. So you've got Section 10b of the Act. You then have Rule 10b-5, which is the rule expanding the definition under that section. It shall be unlawful for any person, directly or indirectly, by the use of any means or instrumentality of interstate commerce or of the mails or of any facility of any national securities exchange to employ any device, scheme, or artifice to defraud. So this is the idea that fraud can take a wide range of different forms, and it usually involves some sort of planning. To make any untrue statement of a material fact or to omit to state a material fact necessary in order to make the statements made in light of the circumstances under which they were made, not misleading. And I'll pull up an example that's just come out on this in a second. Or to engage in any act, practice, or course of business which operates or would operate as a fraud or deceit upon any person in connection with the purchase or sale of securities. So, 10b-5 is significant both because it's your key provision, your key rule on market manipulation in the US, and the market is big. The second aspect is that it is explicitly extraterritorial. In other words, it applies to manipulation, etc., taking place anywhere in the world which impacts securities in the United States. So this is something where you will see the SEC engaging via its own MOUs or via the IOSCO MMOU or directly through its various powers, extraterritorial jurisdiction from this standpoint. The third reason is this rule has often been adopted, copied in slightly modified version by large numbers of other systems of securities regulation around the world. And so from the standpoint of securities regulation, this particular rule has been very, very influential, not only in its own use and operation, but in its adoption by other jurisdictions. I'll just flag a couple of interesting things. This by the use of any means or instrumentality of interstate commerce or the mails or of any facility of a national securities exchange. Basically, the Securities Acts in the United States are federal law. And the U.S. has both a federal jurisdiction as well as state jurisdictions. A federal law to gain federal jurisdiction needs something that crosses state lines. And in the context of many of the U.S. financial and other sorts of regulatory frameworks, the way they will do that is via mail. In other words, any sort of means of communication. Did you mail something? The mail service, the postal service, it's national and therefore subject to federal jurisdiction. They will also use a variety of calls, which may be subject to telecommunications regulations, internet, and this whole idea of any means or instrumentality of interstate commerce is essentially a jurisdictional clause, but it's one that is pretty easy to satisfy, but not always satisfiable. So, you can see point, device, scheme, or artifice to defraud, so it's anything relating to defrauding. Second, untrue statements of a material fact. So a material fact means that it would be relevant to an investor in determining whether to buy or sell securities, basically something that would have an impact on the price or the attractiveness of the security, or omit to state a material fact necessary to make the statements made in light of the circumstances, and or to engage in any act, practice, or course of business which operates or would operate as a fraud or deceit in connection with the purchase of a security. You just pull up one. Elon Musk defrauded Twitter investors during buyout, jury finds. So this is a private action, but one which illustrates the operation of this provision. Panel members concluded the billionaire misled shareholders in tweets posted during the $44 billion takeover. Elon Musk defrauded Twitter shareholders by talking down the company as he tried to renegotiate or delay his $44 billion deal to buy it in 2022, a California jury has found. Jurors in San Francisco on Friday delivered a verdict in favor of a group of investors who sued the billionaire, saying they had lost out because of Musk's, quote, misleading statements in April 2022 during his takeover of the social media platform. Marks a high-profile legal defeat for the world's richest man, who could be liable for substantial damages, which will be determined at a later date. Federal class action suit. So this is a private shareholder's suit for losses as a result of actions. Centered on a series of tweets, Musk wrote in April 2022, weeks after committing to buy the social media company for $44 billion. He said the deal was, quote, temporarily on hold, unquote, until Twitter executives could demonstrate that, quote, spam fake accounts do indeed represent less than 5% of users. Twitter stock fell into the low 30s from a deal price of $54.20 a share as investors priced in the risk of it collapsing. Musk also posted that the deal cannot move forward until Twitter's chief executive showed proof that under 5% of accounts were fake or spam. Group of investors claim they lost out because they sold Twitter stock after the posts at a lower price. In other words, posts, price goes down, shareholders sold, acquisition later closes at the original sale price after Twitter sued Musk in court to enforce the merger agreement. Plaintiffs claim that Musk, who had signed a binding agreement to buy Twitter and waived his right to due diligence, should have known that he did not have the right to walk away. As a result, they argued his tweet that the buyout was, quote, on hold was false because Twitter had not agreed to defer the deals. Lawyer for the investors claim Musk was advised by his bankers on a strategy to cut the purchase price for Twitter by threatening to back out. And there's an actual argument that this was manipulation, that he's actually manipulating the price to gain an advantage. Jurors stopped short of concluding Musk engaged in a fraudulent scheme at the expense of shareholders. So if we look at our framing, we have clearly to make an untrue statement of a material fact. This is what we're seeing here. not a device, scheme, or artifice, and they haven't really focused on Part C either. This is really a 10b5b success, but not a success from the standpoint of 10b5a. Once again, though, this is a private suit by investors on a class basis and not an action by the regulator. All right. So that then puts together, I think, the pieces around conduct, around market manipulation and fraud, around compliance systems, and also around SupTech and RegTech systems. I want to really wrap up with two last things. So we'll come back to this in a minute, but I wanted to just pick up this story that I mentioned because it's a useful illustration of this idea about how IT systems work. So I mentioned this just before the break. This is UBS dusts off, and we'll see why cowbells matter, as it completes transfer of Credit Suisse clients. Swiss Bank hails milestone as it moves 1.2 million customers of former rival onto its systems. So UBS has completed the most complex stage of its integration of Credit Suisse, with executives marking the milestone in a typically Swiss fashion, the ringing of oversized cowbells. The lender this week completed the transfer of 1.2 million of its former rivals' clients on its own system after a 10-month operation involving more than 80,000 tests and 132 hours of staff training. Now, this of course has some direct relevance because we just saw the previous FCA action in the context of highlighting deficiencies in 2019 with UBS's internal IT systems. And so you can see UBS today, one, they've obviously spent a lot of effort on those IT systems, but two, they're putting effort from the standpoint of making sure they all work. This is a change management process. So 80,000 tests, they've done lots of tests to make sure the integrated system works, and 132,000 hours of staff training. That's quite a lot of staff training across the firm. The integration stems from UBS's state-orchestrated takeover of Credit Suisse when it agreed to step in to prevent its competitors' collapse. The combination is the first between two globally systemically important banks and one of the most intricate integrations in the sector's history. The latest phase of the integration involving moving all former Credit Suisse customers whose accounts are managed in Switzerland over to UBS's platforms. Here's the sort of details. The Booking Center Switzerland exercise, merging that number of clients and integrating everything, was the most complex piece of the entire integration because more than 90% of the clients were here, meaning here in Switzerland. So to the extent that if they mess stuff up, population of Switzerland, right around 10 million. This is 1.2 million customers. This is a significant portion of the population of the country. So if you mess this up, you are not going to be popular. So they've spent a lot of effort to get it to work to avoid citizen as well as customer complaints. Preparations included expanding branch and customer support centers and sending more than 3 million client letters, the bank said. More than 6,000 permanent and temporary staff, mostly stationed in a special factory in Zurich, were involved in delivering the project. 3 years after the rescue deal was agreed, some smaller elements of the integration of clients remain, particularly in markets such as Australia, Brazil, and Spain, where UBS must re-engineer or replace Credit Suisse applications, which is essentially their IT systems. All right. Now, last piece I really want to take out from the RegTech SupTech discussion is this: trends. The first is from a digitization standpoint. We're seeing lots of regulators engaging in their own digital transformation strategies. That typically involves digital regulatory reporting requirements. Most securities regulators in the world have moved or are moving towards digital reporting requirements across the sector. That then requires firms to build systems which enable them to collect and report the data required. That data, as we saw with the ICY example from the AMF, are being used with analytics to analyze patterns to better detect issues around market manipulation, misconduct, etc. And we're seeing an increase of enforcement actions that relate to firm IT and compliance systems. So, I've highlighted the UBS example as one where the FCA actually took enforcement actions against all of the major broker-dealers to essentially fine them for reporting problems and mandate them to fix their IT systems in order to support compliance. You can see a reflection of this in the efforts that UBS is undertaking as part of its integration of Credit Suisse. We're now seeing, as we saw with the FCA example, regulators are beginning to analyze the data they're taking in to determine, is there some of it that they don't really need? And to try to a certain extent, consolidate or simplify some of the reporting requirements. The last piece really relates to one other aspect of enforcement, and that is from the standpoint of internal risk management systems. And if we look at drivers, digital regulatory reporting, the sort of reporting requirements, but also these risk management systems. And the one that I want to flag is from the standpoint of a series of periodic actions against Citigroup by US regulators for problems with its compliance and risk management systems. And so this story is here. Now this is from October of 2020. Citigroup fined $400 million for risk management deficiencies. At the very beginning of the course, I flagged this idea about employment in legal and compliance. And I said that in 2006, Citigroup globally had about 135,000 employees. Around 15,000 of those were in legal and compliance. By 2020, Citi started with 235, they cut to 135. So by 2020, Citi had about 135,000 employees and about 35,000 in legal and compliance. So, massive reduction in headcount overall, huge increase in numbers and percentage involved in legal and compliance. And I said there was a reason why I picked 2020. And the reason I picked 2020 was this. After increasing, more than doubling its legal and compliance staff over the previous, more or less, decade, it actually still hadn't solved the problem. And this, I think, is quite interesting. Federal banking regulators will fine Citibank $400 million for shortcomings in its risk management and other internal control processes. The Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, an agency within the Treasury Department, cited serious and long-standing deficiencies and unsafe or unsound practices in Citibank risk management and data governance. Note that, like the UBS FCA example, the regulators are focusing not just on the systems, but also on their data and data systems. The OCC took these actions based on the bank's long-standing failure to establish effective risk management and data governance programs and internal controls. This is doubly significant because Citi was bailed out by the US government in 2008. So, more than a decade after that bailout, the US regulators are fining Citi for still not having sorted out its risk management systems. Penalty comes in conjunction with a separate but related enforcement action by the Federal Reserve Board against Citibank's parent company, Citigroup. The board issued a cease and desist order requiring Citigroup to improve its risk management practices, including in the areas of compliance risk management, data quality management, and internal controls. Federal Reserve noted the action comes after Citigroup failed to adequately address concerns related to risk management and controls that it previously identified in 2013 and 2015. Citi has significant remediation projects underway to strengthen our controls, infrastructure, and governance. These projects are each multi-year and have received significant investment. Bank said it plans, and this is 2020, to invest more than $1 billion a year in its risk management and control efforts, and has hired a chief administrative officer to centralize management of the program and ensure its completion. Should be noted as well that this also coincided with the exit of Citi's previous chief executive as part of the enforcement action. So it actually cost the chief executive his job, but on a positive note, did result in the first female appointment of a chief executive of a globally systemically important bank in the United States, Jane Fraser. Federal Reserve Board's order marks a new responsibility for Jane Fraser, who took over as CEO in February of 2021. Also comes as Citi, like many banks, is grappling with economic uncertainty and other fallout from COVID. Per the order, Citi's board will have 120 days to submit a plan for how it will oversee the required improvements, how it will hold senior management accountable for executing remediation plans, and how it will ensure senior management incentives pay is aligned with risk management incentives. In that time, the bank must also do a gap analysis of the changes necessary to its enterprise-wide risk management framework and internal control systems with regard to 3 areas: capital planning, liquidity risk management, and compliance risk management, before making a plan to address those gaps. The order also lays out requirements for improving Citi's data quality management and compliance risk management program. So, the takeaway here is that we're seeing regulators and supervisors increasingly not only using technology for regulatory and supervisory purposes, particularly around conduct and market manipulation. They are also very heavily focused on enforcing use of technology by those financial institutions to meet those compliance requirements, which are the key mechanism by which they actually address conduct and including things like market manipulation requirements. And it goes back to a question at the very beginning of the course that came from one of you about this idea of whether firms are now beginning to use tech more than headcount in legal and compliance. And the answer is certainly yes. And the expectation increasingly today is that legal and compliance will have a better grasp and understanding of the technological systems that are necessary to manage compliance. And one last story just before you go, and that is, you, FT, JP Morgan. So, there's a suit ongoing against JP Morgan right now and a number of other investment banks about staff not being allowed to sleep. Not that they are not allowed to sleep, but they are expected to work so much, but they never sleep. And so JP Morgan has put in place a system that actually monitors the hours that staff are working. In other words, it looks at when you log on and log off onto your various pieces of equipment, it adds that up, and if it's over a certain amount, it flags you for essentially a compliance issue for working too hard. Right, text, tech. All right, see you guys all tomorrow. Actually, no, it's Thursday or Friday, 5 or 6 p.m. as you prefer. Thanks, guys. Hey. Yeah.
I just have one question regarding the tutorial.
Yeah.
Both of them are on my calendar, so I can attend any of them.
Yeah, I don't know why both. Someone else said the same thing, that they were both on their calendar, but the reality is, it's just one or the other.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
This article, you mean not this?
Yeah,
subject?
it is.
Because this was in March, 20th of March. So it was
Last week.
Last week.
Yeah.
Is it the same?
It is. So the lawsuit is ongoing, but this article about the new system is
They
the
said
one.
to
Try to keep their work hours down.
Yeah, but it is to push them harder, right?
Yeah. But it's partially you push yourself harder, but yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, they sell it for a different purpose than they're gonna use it for. Since with the data, I saw some comments on a news article. The data they get out of this tool can be used to replace humans,
Exactly.
which is
Exactly. With banks, there's always a profit motive.
yeah. And they can also sell the data and develop.
Exactly. Good.